evening. I'm Sarah Watson, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's show, Walking in Lincoln's Footsteps in Vermilion County. This is part of our series of Looking for Lincoln conversations. Abraham Lincoln spent the autumn and spring traveling throughout Vermilion County in eastern Illinois while writing the 8th Judicial Circuit. Tonight, we will explore some of the sites he visited and meet some of the individuals he met and worked with as he traveled the eastern prairie. Sue Richter is the executive director of the Vermilion County Museum in Danville, Illinois. She and her husband, Don, have done extensive research on Abraham Lincoln in Vermilion County. For more information about the Looking for Lincoln conversations, visit the Looking for Lincoln Facebook page. It's now my pleasure to introduce Sue Richter.
Good evening, Sarah. Thank you for having me this evening here on the show. It's very nice to be able to invite people in their homes to do a slight walk with us this evening as we tour the sites that Lincoln saw when he came here to Vermilion County. As we begin our presentation, I want to mention that when Abraham Lincoln came to the county, first coming to the Danville area in 1841, he traveled many of the roads here in the county, which still exist today. One of them, the Old State Road, still today retains its name. It's the Old Lincoln Trail Road. So this is something that we consider very unique here in Vermilion County. Now, when he first came here to Vermilion County, he came to attend a court case that he was presenting for his good friend, Dr. William Fithian. He and Fithian had met in 1834 during the time that both of them were in the Illinois House of Representatives. Lincoln did have over 219 cases here in Vermilion County. When he came to Danville, it was a center of commerce. It was the eastern gateway to central Illinois. It was the site of the land office where tens of thousands of acres of land were purchased from the federal government. As we begin our tour, we're going to start in downtown Danville and do the surrounding area right here in town. Our first slide shows the Presbyterian Church and Reverend Enoch Kingsbury, who was the minister there at the church. He came to Illinois and to the village about 1831. He was an ardent abolitionist who often spoke strongly, even from the pulpit, against slavery, and Lincoln was one of his close friends. He was actually appointed postmaster of Danville by President Abraham Lincoln while Lincoln was in office. When Lincoln attended church at any time he was on the circuit here in Danville, the First Presbyterian Church was where he could be found on Sunday mornings. The next picture is the Red Seminary, which was here on Pine Street. It was built in about 1836, and it used to have a wide expanse of lawn to the front. During one of Lincoln's many trips to Danville, one evening at the hotel where he was staying, the other lawyers all of a sudden noticed that Lincoln was not there. He didn't make his normal appearance after supper. They asked where he had been upon his return later that night, and he informed them that he had been seeing the local magic lantern show that was produced at the seminary that night. So it was often used by individuals here in Danville as an entertainment spot in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. The McCormick House Hotel was just a few blocks down the street from where the Red Seminary stood. It was where many of the lawyers, including Lincoln, stayed when they were riding the circuit. Following court, they would often gather in the large room, the common area of the hotel, and Lincoln, of course, a lot of time held forth by entertaining individuals with stories. While staying at the McCormick House Hotel on November 13th of 1859, Lincoln wrote his acceptance letter to speak in New York at Cooper Union. Of course, we all know that this was credited with being an important milestone on his road to the presidency. Just to the west side in Danville, you can find one of the Lincoln markers that talks about Lincoln coming to Danville and what Danville was like at the time he came. And it has another picture of the McCormick House Hotel on it and some of the individuals, Lincoln and Lehman, that were here in Danville at that time. A little farther from there on West Main Street, you would find the Lincoln Hall. This was a building erected in 1859 by W.W.R. Woodbury. It was the tallest building in Danville at that time, and it was 3 stories and a very interesting building. The building itself was named Lincoln Hall. When Lincoln was informed of this, we are told that he was embarrassed, and he talked to the doctor about it, and he said he hoped he would have better luck with the name being on his building that a dog that was named in honor of Lincoln had. Lincoln stated after the dog's name was changed to Lincoln, he got licked in every fight he was in. Lincoln often could be found at Woodbury's bookstore in the lower level of Lincoln Hall. This was one of the places that patrons of the area would hang out, and another spot that Lincoln used to extend his storytelling in the area. Just almost directly across the street from Dr. Woodbury's Lincoln Hall building was the Barnum Building. The second floor of the Barnum Building was where Lincoln and Ward Hill Layman would establish their office in 1852, which accounted for the many cases that were heard at this far eastern point on the circuit. Ward Hill Layman was a Virginian and had come to Danville in 1847. He met Lincoln that same year and they became friends. After Layman obtained his law degree, they opened the office in 1852, as I said, and Judge Davis remarked that Lincoln often said of Layman that there was no man he trusted more than Layman. He referred to the Virginian as his particular friend. Historian Clint Tilton added to this and said, Lincoln is a quiet teller of stories. Layman was the boisterous singer of sentimental ballads and the so-called comic songs of the 1850s. Lincoln is the joker whose pranks never go farther than to place the victim in a ridiculous position. Layman's sense of humor, however, is not satisfied unless there is an element of danger. Lincoln delights in a solitary evening, wrestling with Euclid. Layman prefers sport, ever ready to participate in a horse race, a foot race, a wrestling match, or back to his skill in a real game of money of old sledge or wrist. Lincoln only tastes intoxicants while Layman buys his liquor by the gallon. These two were a distinct set of partners in this office. Later on, when Lincoln became president, Layman was appointed Marshal of the District of Columbia and would later serve as Lincoln's bodyguard. Downtown area of Danville also boasts the courthouse where Lincoln practiced law, and another one of our local looking for Lincoln signs that talks about the individual friends that were there with him. Now, one of the main friends here that shows in the lower corner by the courthouse is Oliver L. Davis. Lincoln came to Danville, as I said, in 1841, and he was very commonplace about coming. In one of his letters home, he wrote, Baker and I are with Webb at Vermilion. He would often be on the same side as Oliver Davis in a case, or oftentimes they opposed each other. When the Republican convention was held in Chicago in 1860, which nominated Lincoln for president, David served as one of the floor managers, Davis, and was also elected as secretary. So he was very well known to Abraham Lincoln and those in this area. He developed a successful law practice and had the distinction of being elected both to the Illinois state legislature, both as a Democrat and a Republican. As we travel around the west side of Danville, you will come upon the home of Dr. William Fithian, one of the closer friends in the Danville area of Abraham Lincoln. The doctor built his house, as you can see in the picture here. It was completed in 1855 and given as a wedding present to his fourth wife, Josephine Culberson Black. Fithian When he came to the area and would spend the night, and not at the McCormick House Hotel, often spent the night with the doctor, especially if there was supposed to be some sort of political discussion of the evening and other Whigs and Republicans invited into the home to attend. Dr. Fithian was in Bloomington in May of 1856 at the Republican convention, where Lincoln gave his famous lost speech. He also was on the campaign tour when Lincoln was there fighting against Stephen Douglas for a seat in the U.S. Senate. Fithian gave speeches for Lincoln when Lincoln ran for Senate and for the presidency. He was also a financial supporter of Lincoln's campaign and was on hand in Chicago when Lincoln won the nomination in 1860. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln appointed Dr. Fithian provost marshal for the Danville area. Before Fithian's death, an interviewer asked him, the aged physician, for a comment about his friend who became president. It's noted that Fithian thought a few moments and then said, "He was just Lincoln," as if just his name explained it all. Here you can see a stone that sits in the east corner of the property of the Dr. William Fithian home that commemorates the speech he gave from the balcony you can see here on the south side of the building. It's one of the unique stories attached to Dr. Fithian in the house. Lincoln had arrived that day. It was during the time of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and they were kind of playing hopscotch across the state in between the debates. During the day, Lincoln had come in the afternoon. They said about the 4 o'clock train that arrived at the train station. He walked from the old Wabash station to the house. People gathered in the yard below where there was a grove of hickory trees, and they wanted Lincoln to give a speech. He'd taken his boots off from traveling all day, informed the doctor he could not get them back on, and the doctor suggested he step out the window to the balcony that you can see in the picture and speak to the people in the yard below. And this is what Lincoln did. On the placard from the Looking for Lincoln Wayside exhibit there, it tells the story of Lincoln talking from the balcony and his visit to the doctor in 1858. On the west side of town, as you get ready to leave, is one of the early Lincoln markers. This is a marker that was put up by the DAR, and it says that Lincoln rode this way when he rode the 8th Judicial Circuit. This is the route he would have used coming from Urbana, coming into town from the west. So this marker there at Main and Logan commemorates that site. On the east side, we do have the picture of the Wabash station. Whenever he arrived by train, usually from the south from Springfield, this is the station that he came into on the east side. This is also the station from which he made his last speech upon leaving Danville on his way to the presidency. At this time, Lincoln made a promise that if he had blessings at his disposal, old Vermilion would come in for a bountiful share. Fithian was not there that day, nor were some of his other friends that he knew from the area in order to say goodbye to him as he went east to Washington to assume the presidency. One of those friends who was not there that day but lived very close to the railroad station on the east side of town was Oscar F. Harmon. Lincoln often visited with the Harmons and even spent a Thanksgiving dinner with them. One of the things Lincoln thoroughly enjoyed was listening to Harmon's daughter Eleanor play the piano. Harmon was elected to the Illinois House of Representatives in 1858, and Abraham Lincoln served as his mentor, giving him direction following his election. He and Harmon would remain friends, and Harmon and O.L. Davis, who we had mentioned earlier, would join together to form a partnership as attorneys. But in 1860, soon after Lincoln's he did not seek re-election to the House of Representatives, went back to practicing law full-time. Then in 1862, he recruited men, and he served as the colonel of the 125th Illinois Volunteer Infantry. On June 27th in 1864, Harmon was killed at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. Also on the east side is commemoration at an area used to be known as the Grove. Today it's Douglas Park in Danville. And this is where Douglas spoke on the same day that Lincoln spoke from the balcony at the museum. As I said, they were kind of playing hopscotch with each other. Davis had come in earlier that day to the Grove. Lincoln had come in to Danville and was taken to Dr. Fithian's house. The next day, Douglas departed, and Lincoln was taken to the Grove to speak at a political rally. One of the unique things that happened that Mrs. Harmon, the colonel's wife, recorded was that on the drive to the Grove on the outskirts of town, where the speech was to be made, an undertaker was passing the carriage that they were riding in. And seeing the sign of a coffin, Lincoln pointed to it and said, "That is what we are all speeding to." At the National Cemetery on the far eastern side is a commemorative of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address that sits at the entrance to the cemetery, a very fitting resting place for those individuals who reside in the cemetery from all the different wars. If we go down to the southern part, south of Danville, the first marker we will find if we get to Tilton is at the home of Joseph Kirtland. He was a friend of Lincoln's, and Lincoln visited there in the 1850s. A little farther south is Abraham Smith in Ridge Farm. There is no distinct marker here, but Abraham Smith was one of the Quaker residents in the southern portion of the county. He came here and established what was called a tavern to entertain and put up all of those who were traveling along Route 1 back then. And Abraham Lincoln was often a guest at the tavern as he traveled the circuit from Danville to Paris, Illinois. In 1853, Smith had platted the town of Ridge Farm. He was the most outspoken amongst all the Quaker settlers and in Vermilion County. He was a staunch abolitionist. He served as a conductor on the Underground Railroad that passed through this portion of the state. When Lincoln ran for the presidency the first time, Abraham Smith questioned a lot of Lincoln's feelings towards slavery and his commitment to freeing the slaves. Abraham Smith corresponded with Lincoln heavily, and by the time Lincoln ran for the president the second time, he carried all of the Quaker votes in the southern part of Vermilion County due to the work of Abraham Smith from Ridge Farm. A little bit south of there is the circuit marker that's at the Edgar Vermilion County line on what is Illinois Route 1 today. This marker was dedicated in 1923 and is one of the early markers that was placed throughout Vermilion County by the Daughters of the American Revolution. As we go to the west, heading along I-74, going east to west, at the Salkettah Rest area, guests are often asked to view the gravestone of Mr. Edward M. Wilson. Wilson actually had fought during the Revolutionary War and came to Vermilion County in 1832. He died in 1840, and in 1851, Abraham Lincoln and John H. Murphy represented his heirs in a case and sued against his guardian, who at that time just happened to be one of Lincoln's other close friends, Reverend Enoch Kingsbury. The site today is preserved with a new marker for Edward and his wife that tells his history of coming to the area, serving in the Revolutionary War, and being at the battle where the Star-Spangled Banner was written. As you continue to travel west along Route 150 today, you will pass what is known as the area where the Willis Hubbard home was situated. It was another one of those small way stations on the circuit that often attorneys that were riding the circuit would stop at. It was on the south side of 150, just on the outskirts of Oakwood, Illinois. As you continue on what was called the Old State Road, you would cross over Stony Creek, known as Stony Creek Ford. It's one of the most beautiful spots in Vermilion County, especially during the fall, as the trees change, and you often wonder when Lincoln traveled the circuit in the fall, what he saw as he went here. This marker was placed to mark where Lincoln forded this ford from 1841 to 56 when he was traveling to and from Vermilion County. This portion of the road is what is Lincoln Trail Road today. As you continue west, you're going to come to one of the last stops along the road, which is the John L. Thompson home. It's actually called Lincoln Post Farm. It's the old home of the Thompson family, and it pays tribute to the Mr. Thompson who started the farm and to Lincoln. And it says the marker reads, in memory of John Thompson, 1830 to 1895, a friend of Lincoln. Soon after passing the Thompson marker, you'll come to the Lincoln Trail marker on the Champaign to Vermilion County line. This is one of the last markers that the DAR placed, also in the 1920s, and the Lincoln Marker Association. As you travel these roads, especially the old state road, the road itself is much the same as what it was when Lincoln traveled here in Vermilion County. It was one of the most interesting areas to travel. It was heavily wooded, and then it opened into the prairie with tall blue stem, taller than a man on a horse. We can only wonder what Lincoln thought about as he was traveling, coming along with his horse, his bag, his carpet bag, his tall top hat, and visiting with his friends that lived along the route. They were many and varied from all walks of life, making Lincoln truly a man of the people at that time. We can go backwards and take another quick look at some of the slides. One of the unique things is you're invited to stop at the museum where you can pick up a little booklet that goes along as you travel around this area. It gives interesting facts and features on both the sites and those individuals that Lincoln met coming and going here in Vermilion County. Vermilion County was very fortunate to have individuals that started recording the early county history back when a lot of the individuals who knew Lincoln were still here. Hiram Beckwith wrote extensively about Lincoln, his travels in the county, and those individuals he met. He would serve as the first president of the Illinois State Historical Society, which offered him a unique opportunity to be able to interview people who knew Lincoln firsthand that were still here in the county at that time when he began his searching and writing his history in about 1870.
Thanks, Sue.
You're welcome.
There we go. All right, everyone. My name is Heather Fieser, and thank you for tuning in this evening. It is now time to take your questions. So I know I've seen a couple in the comments so far, but if you have a question and you would like to ask about Lincoln and Vermilion County, please type it in the chat, and we will try to get through as many of those as possible. And so I thought before we actually got to questions, you might explain a little bit about where you're sitting, because I think it's very special, and I think our audience should. I know what it is, but I think our audience should know where you're sitting.
Yes, I'm sitting at the desk that was in Lincoln's office in the Barnum building that we talked about. It was one room on the second floor, and he and Ward Hill Lehman shared that office. Lehman was in the office throughout the year. Lincoln would come in and out spring and fall as the circuit deemed in cases here in Vermilion County. So here in the new museum building, which is a replica of the courthouse that Lincoln practiced law in when he was here in Danville, we have a corner where we have a reconstructed Lincoln Law Office. And that is where the desk came from. And it's a partner's desk. So actually Lincoln and Lehman sat opposite each other. As we tell the students that come, with two men, both over 6 feet, sitting at this one desk, we often wondered how they were able to do it and if they bumped knees or anything else in doing so. But it is kind of unique to be able to sit and give a program on Lincoln from a desk that we know he sat in and at and worked from here in Vermilion County in the 1840s and 50s when he was here. The bookcase behind us is one that was built by an individual, Dr. Asia Palmer, here in Danville. He was one of the first doctors. So it's kind of unique to have it in the office. And then we have a picture of Lincoln behind me, and then there's a portrait of him on the other side. And as most people know, when Lincoln traveled the circuit, he didn't have his beard. So most of the pictures here in the office, Lincoln appears beardless.
Okay, thank you. I just thought I'd give a little context for our audience before we start answering questions. All right, so our first question is about the seminary you talked about near the very beginning. They want to know why it was called Red Seminary.
Okay, it was a unique situation here in Danville, and there were actually two seminaries. One was called the Red Seminary and one was called the White Seminary. Why they did it specifically, one was Methodist and the other was Presbyterian, and they were kind of always fighting with each other. And this one actually is the one that managed to, withhold, hold forth, whatever, and survive. It was actually used as a school in the 1830s when it was built in 36. And it was like a public school, but it was like subscription. So you paid a fee to be able to go to the school. So it was one of the early ones here in Danville. And sometimes they call it Danville Academy rather than calling it the Red Seminary. But that was the distinction. And I think it was just supposed to be associated with maybe the colors on their church flags or whatever. But there was big battles and big articles in the newspaper between the White Seminary and the Red Seminary. And this one was the Red Seminary.
Very interesting. Okay, who knew? Fun facts. Okay, I have another question, and the question is about this. Is there a statue at the museum? And I think they're thinking of your very unique statue, Sue.
Yes, we have a Lincoln statue here at the museum. It is done from a descriptions of Lincoln, especially early ones. Most of them were in the Paris Prairie Beacon at that time. And they said that Lincoln, when he stood without his greatcoat and he would stand and talk, he looked like a sandhill crane with his long legs and his long arms. So ours is of Lincoln standing with his chair. It's the storyteller pose. His coat's off. He's relaxed. His shirt is open. His top hat is to his side. The students like to walk around him because they can see his suspenders and they can see his pocket watch chain and things of that sort. And it's probably just a little taller than Lincoln actually was because he does have his boots on and he's a little bit on a platform, but he's standing there leaning on the chair. So it's a very relaxed pose of Lincoln.
Okay, thank you. All right, so here's our next question. What types of cases did Lincoln represent? And let's think about specifically ones that he would have done in Danville when he was. So what types of cases would Lincoln as a lawyer have taken in Danville, Illinois?
There were all sorts of libel suits, estate settlings. As we know from Kingsbury, it was a prosecuting case against the heirs of an estate. A lot of the documentation that they found here in Danville when they were searching for the legal case project that they did, they found them in the estate files. They found them in the probate files, a lot of probate cases. There were a lot of times when Lincoln first came to Danville, he really didn't have a whole lot of cases. It said one day he was sitting on a bench down by the courthouse watching an organ grinder and then watching an ant. And he said, he hoped they seemed busier than he was at the time. So a lot of times it was very slow. He did a lot of estate work for individuals that he met. In the case of Dr. Fithian, he did libel suits and things of that sort. So it was wide and varied, pretty much whatever, they had. But in Danville, because it was the center for this area, court cases were very special. A lot of the court cases were even held on Fridays and Saturdays because it was a time when people came to town, especially the farmers. So they were able to fill the seats and the stands in the courthouse with people watching the cases. So it was like the entertainment for the city at that time. So if there was a court case, people would drop in and out. So he would he would come in and he and Layman would work on cases. And as I said, sometimes O.L. Davis would be working with him. Other times he would be against him. The same way with Harmon. Sometimes Lincoln would be the prosecutor, sometimes the defense attorney. So they were really wide and varied and covered a wide range of subjects.
All right, thank you. All right, so here is our next question. And what I think they're asking is the Judge Davis that you talked about the same that is the executor of Lincoln's estate?
There's two Judge Davises that we talk about. There's O.L. Davis and there's Judge David Davis. Quite truthfully, the attorneys on the circuit distinguished them by Big Davis and Little Davis. O.L. Little Davis. Although if you saw the picture of O.L. Davis, he was quite a large gentleman also, but not as big as David Davis from Bloomington. And it seems kind of strange to think that he had two close friends, both with the same last name. And it's kind of unique, when you think about it for the time frame. But Oliver Davis is what most of them call Little Davis compared to David Davis, who was very large. He wasn't really fat, but he was just a large individual, tall and stalwart and very large. So that was the distinction between the two Davises. And oftentimes they get confused. So a lot of times we always refer to Oliver Davis as just O.L. Davis. And that's the way they refer to him. And he is buried here in Danville. And he corresponded with Lincoln a lot after Lincoln became president. And he remained in Danville the rest of his life and died here in 1892.
Okay, that was very interesting. All right, now I have another question for you, Sue. So, of all of the Lincoln stories that there are of Lincoln and Danville, what is your favorite?
I like the story that goes with the Fithian home. To think of your president in his stocking feet, stepping out on a balcony, giving a speech is you can imagine it, but you don't really think about it. But the strangest thing of the whole story is all these people were there and no one, kind of like the lost speech that was one of the previous conversations, nobody thought to record what he said. It just reported him being there, giving the speech, spending that night and the next night with his friend, Dr. Fithian, and giving it in his stocking feet. That seemed to be what impressed people the most, was him doing that. And what impresses me about it is when you think of how tall Lincoln was, although the windows at the Fithian home are quite large, they're sash windows that lift up from the bottom. So it wasn't like he had a doorway he could go out. He had to open the sash window and then bend down that tall frame to crawl out that window and step onto that balcony. And it's hard to imagine him doing that, and what a sight he must have been to the people in the yard below.
Probably not excessively dignified.
No, not what you would expect from someone. Of course, at that time, he was just running for the U.S. Senate,
Just the U.S. Senate.
The U.S. Senate, right. Wasn't running for the president yet.
No. Okay. So that is your favorite story.
I think so. Yeah.
Well, it is a very fun story. For those of you who don't know, you can go to Danville and visit the Fithian house and stand in the room where that took place. You can't go out on the little porch, but you can stand in the room where Lincoln stood.
And you can you can literally walk in his footsteps because it's still the original floor.
Yeah. All right. So here's our next question, Sue. All right. So it says Fithian reputedly told Lincoln that Martin Van Buren favored the vote for free blacks in New York. That did not sit well with Illinoisans in the late 1830s. Lincoln used the story to disparage Van Buren and Douglas, his supporter. How politically active was Fithian?
Fithian was very active in politics, local politics. He was, of course, the local Whig. And then when the party changed over to the Republicans, Lincoln became a very fierce devotee of the Republican Party. And so it was not unusual for Fithian to hold large political rallies at his house. Now, back then, a large political rally, maybe 20 to 30 people, but he would often accept them into his home because he had built the large home. He had plenty of space. And he continued this throughout the war, and especially during the Civil War. He was very much an advocate for the Republican Party, for Lincoln, and for what the Civil War stood for. And during the time of the Civil War, he and his family oftentimes were in danger. One of the stories of the home that is told in the letters that were written by Mary Black Fithian to her brothers who were at school at Wabash College over in Indiana at the time. This is just at the beginning and the start of the Civil War, was that everybody was clamoring for Lincoln to do this and do that. And he was going to uphold as provost marshal the laws that were in place that time. And people were, at that time, kind of like, I guess you could say, the political dissidents of today were marching towards his house. And Mary wrote that they had taken their precious belongings and buried them in the cistern behind the house in order to protect their valuables during this time. But Fithian stayed steadfast. Lincoln appointed him provost marshal here of the area. And it is our understanding from the Fithian family records that are available that Lincoln wanted Fithian to accompany him to Washington, D.C. But Fithian made the statement that he would rather be a big fish in a little pond rather than a little fish in a big pond. So he used his political clout locally, and that's what he wanted to do.
Okay. Here's another question. Do you know of any time where the Lincoln children ever accompanied Lincoln to Danville?
Not that I am aware of. I do not. I know that Robert Todd Lincoln came after Lincoln's death, but as to whether or not the children or Mrs. Lincoln ever accompanied him to Danville, we have no record of it.
They typically did not travel with him when he was on the Judicial Circuit.
No, usually they didn't. No. And what's really unusual is Layman had a young daughter who actually became acquainted with Lincoln. And oftentimes they sat in the carriage, even in Washington, D.C., Lincoln and Layman would be in the carriage and she would sit on the floor of the carriage. And she wrote about sitting on the floor of the carriage and seeing her father and Lincoln traveling about Washington City. So wow. That's really unique. Yeah.
That's a cool story. I never knew that one.
Yeah.
That's a cool story that he took his family with him to Washington. And then, yeah, that's cool. Yeah. Okay. All right. So here is another question. Of the many places that you showed us in the pictures today, how many of those are still in existence today?
In existence today, the Red Seminary came down a few years ago. Presbyterian Church is still there. Of course, not that church, but it is still in the same location that it is today. The Barnum building is no longer there. It's where Breezy Tower, our skyscraper, is now, which will be coming down in the future because it is deteriorating. Colonel Oscar Harmon's house is still there. Of course, the train station is gone, although the train tracks are still there. So it still runs the same route it did then. On Stony Creek, of course, the bridge crossing the site is still there. The Pioneer Cemetery, of course, is still there where Edwin Wilson is buried. So most of the sites are just commemorated, but the buildings are no longer there. Of course, the Fithian home is still here. Yeah.
Yeah.
So probably about 4 definite. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. And of course, the courthouse that we have today is situated in the same spot as that courthouse that Lincoln practiced law in. The county courthouse has always been at the same spot since the 1830s.
So it just has a newer building on it.
Just a newer building, right.
Yeah. Probably a couple between Lincoln's time and today.
Well, the one that Lincoln practiced law in was actually burnt in 1872, and it was the first recorded case of arson in the county.
Wow.
So it's kind of unique. And then they built the next courthouse, and then in 1921, I believe it was, they remodeled the courthouse, and people would not float a tax bond to build a new courthouse. They had tax money from a previous bond that they could use for renovation of the courthouse building. So they literally tore the courthouse down to its cornerstone and built the next courthouse. And then eventually we came with the courthouse we have today. So just quirky little stories.
Wow, who knew? Danville was so fascinating. Okay, here's our next question. Is the Lehman house in Danville where Lehman lived?
No. This house that's named the Lehman House is in honor of Ward Hill Lehman. The house itself was situated on North Street, very close to the Dr. Fithian's home, almost catty corner from it. And it was actually built by Melissa Beckwith Lehman, who married Joseph Lehman. And the historical tie for the house, the bigger tie, is the fact that Melissa was the daughter of Dan Beckwith, who Danville is named after. And the house was built on the last piece of property that the family owned. And so the house was a cottage house. It's probably the oldest frame structure now left in Danville. The main 4 rooms were split log with siding over the top of it. And in order to preserve the house, we moved it to Lincoln Park. Very fitting that it's in Lincoln Park, and named it in honor of Ward Hill Lehman. But we don't even know if Lehman was ever in the home. There's no documented evidence of that.
Yeah.
So it's just named in honor of him because of his cousin Joseph living there with Melissa Beckwith.
Okay. Cool. Thank you. It was very informative. Well, I think we have wrapped up all of our questions, but we have one more question, Sue. This is the one we ask all of our presenters. It's a really hard one. Why? It's not really. Why do you think in the 21st century we should still be studying the life of Abraham Lincoln?
I think because a lot of times we understand that history repeats itself. And in studying Lincoln, we can only hope that the same wrong decisions that might have been made during that time will not be made again, that the good choices that were made can flourish and carry on. And without discovering who Lincoln was, the man he was before he became president, we don't really know the reasoning behind the decisions that were made as he served as president. And I think by learning about him, we learn about the people, and we learn about the people that helped to make up the state of Illinois and what it is today by those forerunners that came from the past.
That was a great answer. Thanks, Sue.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It was a pleasure having you on Looking for Lincoln Conversations this evening. So we'd like to thank our audience for tuning on, and we will be back next month with another program. And we want to thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you again. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.